Military logistics is the discipline of planning and carrying out the movement and maintenance of military forces. In its most comprehensive sense, it is those aspects or military operations that deal with design, development, acquisition, storage, distribution, maintenance, evacuation, and disposition of materiel, transport of personnel, acquisition or construction, maintenance, operation, and disposition of facilities, acquisition or furnishing of services, medical and health service support. History. The word logistics is derived from the Greek adjective logistikos, meaning skilled in calculating. The first administrative use of the word was in Roman and Byzantine times when there was a military administrative official with the title logista. At that time, the word apparently implied a skill involved in numerical computations. Historically, supplies for an army were first acquired by foraging or looting, especially in the case of food and fodder. Although if traveling through a desolated region or staying in one place for too long, resources could quickly be exhausted. A second method was for the army to bring along what was needed, whether by ships, pack animals, wagons, or carried on the backs of the soldiers themselves. This allowed the army some measure of self-sufficiency, and up through to the 19th century most of the ammunition a soldier needed for an entire campaign could be carried on the person. However, this method led to an extensive baggage train which could slow down the army's advance, and the development of faster-firing weapons soon outpaced an army's ability to supply itself. Starting with the Industrial Revolution, new technological, technical and administrative advances led to a third method, that of maintaining supplies in a rear area and transporting them to the front. This led to a logistical revolution, which began in the 20th century and drastically improved the capabilities of modern armies while making them highly dependent on this new system. 16th century. Starting in the late 16th century, armies in Europe greatly increased in size, upwards of 100,000 or more in some cases. This increase in size came not just in the number of actual soldiers but also camp followers, anywhere from half to 1.5 the size of the army itself, and the size of the baggage train, averaging 1 wagon for every 15 men. However, very little state support was provided to these massive armies, the vast majority of which consisted of mercenaries. Beyond being paid for their service by the state, an act which bankrupted even the Spanish Empire on several occasions, these soldiers and the commanders were forced to provide everything for themselves. If permanently assigned to a town or city with a working marketplace, or traveling along a well-established military route, supplies could be easily bought locally with intendants overseeing the exchanges. In other cases, an army traveling in friendly territory could expect to be followed by sutlers, although their supply stocks were small and subject to price gouging, or a commissioner could be sent ahead to a town to make arrangements, including quartering if necessary. When operating in enemy territory, an army was forced to plunder the local countryside for supplies. A historical tradition meant to allow war to be conducted at the enemy's expense. However, with the increase in army sizes, this reliance on plunder became a major problem, as many decisions regarding where an army could move or fight were made based not on strategic objectives but whether a given area was capable of supporting the soldiers' needs. Sieges in particular were affected by this, both for any army attempting to lay siege to a location or coming to its relief. Unless a military commander was able to implement some sort of regular resupply, a fortress or town with a devastated countryside could be effectively immune to either operation. Conversely, armies of this time had little need to maintain lines of communication while on the move, except insofar as it was necessary to recruit more soldiers, and thus could not be cut off from non-existent supply bases. Although this theoretically granted armies freedom of movement, the need for plunder prevented any sort of sustained, purposeful advance. Many armies were further restricted to following waterways due to the fact that what supplies they were forced to carry could be more easily transported by boat. Artillery in particular was reliant on this method of travel, since even a modest number of cannons required hundreds of horses to pull overland and traveled at half the speed of the rest of the army. 17th century. By the 17th century, the French Under-Secretary of State for War Michel Letellier began a series of military reforms to address some of these issues. Besides ensuring that soldiers were more regularly paid and combating the corruption and inefficiencies of private contractors, Letellier devised formulas to calculate the exact amount of supplies necessary for a given campaign, created standardized contracts for dealing with commercial suppliers, and formed a permanent vehicle park manned by army specialists whose job was to carry a few days' worth of supplies while accompanying the army during campaigns. With these arrangements there was a gradual increase in the use of magazines which could provide a more regular flow of supply via convoys. While the concept of magazines and convoys was not new at this time, prior to the increase in army sizes there had rarely been cause to implement them. Despite these changes, French armies still relied on plunder for a majority of their needs while on the move. Magazines were created for specific campaigns and any surplus was immediately sold for both monetary gain and to lessen the tax burden. The vehicles used to form convoys were contracted out from commercial interests or requisitioned from local stockpiles. In addition, given warfare of this era's focus on fortified towns and an inability to establish front lines or exert a stabilizing control over large areas, these convoys often needed armies of their own to provide escort. Disambiguation needed. The primary benefits of these reforms was to supply an army during a siege. This was borne out in the successful campaign of 1658, when the French army at no point was forced to end a siege on account of supplies, including the siege of Dunkirk. Letellier's son Louvois would continue his father's reforms after assuming his position. The most important of these was to guarantee free daily rations for the soldiers, amounting to 2 pounds of bread or hardtack a day. These rations were supplemented as circumstances allowed by a source of protein such as meat or beans. Soldiers were still responsible for purchasing these items out of pocket, but they were often available at below market prices or even free at the expense of the state. He also made permanent a system of magazines which were overseen by local governors to ensure they were fully stocked. Part of these magazines were dedicated to frontier towns and fortresses to provide several months' worth of supplies in the event of a siege, while the rest were dedicated to supporting French armies operating in the field. With these reforms, French armies enjoyed one of the best logistical systems in Europe. However, there were still severe restrictions on its capabilities. Only a fraction of an army's supply needs could be met by the magazines, requiring that it continue to use plunder. In particular, this was true for perishable goods or those too bulky to store and transport, such as fodder. The administration and transportation of supplies remained inadequate and subject to the deprivations of private contractors. The primary aim of this system was still to keep an army supplied while conducting a siege, a task for which it succeeded, rather than an increased freedom of movement. 18th century. The British were seriously handicapped in the American Revolutionary War by the need to ship all supplies across the Atlantic. Since the Patriots prevented most local purchases, the British found a solution after the war by creating the infrastructure and the experience needed to manage an empire. London reorganised the management of the supply of military food and transport that was completed in 1793–94 when the Naval Victualling and Transport Boards undertook those responsibilities. It built upon experience the supply of the very long-distance Falklands garrison to systematize needed shipments to distant places such as Australia, Nova Scotia, and Sierra Leone. This new infrastructure allowed Britain to launch large expeditions to the continent during the French Revolutionary War and to develop a global network of colonial garrisons. 19th century Napoleon. Until the Napoleonic Wars, the military supply was ensured by looting, requisition or private companies. In 1807, Napoleon created the first train regiments, entirely dedicated to the supply and the transport of the equipment. However, Napoleon typically tried to live off the country. He called it war-feeding war. However, it made his army vulnerable to the scorched earth policy conducted by the Russians in 1812, which burned the food supplies Napoleon had counted upon. The French system failed as well in Spain, in the Peninsular Wars, where the supplies found in the occupied territory were insufficient for French needs. The French scrambled to find alternative sources in the face of a guerrilla war that targeted supplies, and the British blockade of Spanish ports. Logistical operations largely took center stage in French strategy. The need to supply a besieged Barcelona made it impossible to control the province and ended French plans to incorporate Catalonia into Napoleon's empire. The first theoretical analysis was by the Swiss writer, Antoine-Henri Jomini, who studied the Napoleonic Wars. In 1838, he devised a theory of war on the trinity of strategy, ground tactics, and logistics. Railways and steamboats revolutionized logistics by the mid-19th century. In the American Civil War, both armies used railways extensively, for transport of personnel, supplies, horses and mules, and heavy field pieces. Both tried to disrupt the enemy's logistics by destroying trackage and bridges. During the 7 Weeks' War of 1866, railways enabled the swift mobilization of the Prussian army. But the problem of moving supplies from the end of rail lines to units at the front resulted in nearly 18,000 tons trapped on trains unable to be unloaded to ground transport. The Prussian use of railways during the Franco-Prussian War is often cited as a prime example of logistic modernizations. But the advantages of maneuver were often gained by abandoning supply lines that became hopelessly congested with rear area traffic. World War I. During World War I, unrestricted submarine warfare had a significant impact on the ability of Britain's allies to keep shipping lanes open. While the great size of the German army proved too much for its railways to support except while immobilized in trench warfare, modern developments, logistics, occasionally referred to as combat service support, must address highly uncertain conditions. While perfect forecasts are rarely possible, forecast models can reduce uncertainty about what supplies or services will be needed, where and when they will be needed, or the best way to provide them. Ultimately, responsible officials must make judgments on these matters, sometimes using intuition and scientifically weighing alternatives as the situation requires and permits. Their judgments must be based not only upon professional knowledge of the numerous aspects of logistics itself but also upon an understanding of the interplay of closely related military considerations such as strategy, tactics, intelligence, training, personnel, and finance. However, case studies have shown that more quantitative, statistical analysis are often a significant improvement on human judgment. One such recent example is the use of applied information economics by the Office of Naval Research and the Marine Corps for forecasting bulk fuel requirements for the battlefield. In major military conflicts, logistics matters are often crucial in deciding the overall outcome of wars. For instance, tonnage war, the bulk sinking of cargo ships, was a crucial factor in World War II. The successful Allied anti-submarine campaign and the failure of the German Navy to sink enough cargo in the Battle of the Atlantic allowed Britain to stay in the war and established the Second Front against the Nazis. By contrast, the successful U.S. submarine campaign against Japanese maritime shipping across Asian waters effectively crippled its economy and its military production capabilities. In a tactical scale, in the Battle of Ilomantsai, the Soviets had an overwhelming numerical superiority in guns and men, but managed to fire only 10,000 shells against the Finnish 36,000 shells. eventually being forced to abandon their heavy equipment and flee the battlefield, resulting in a Finnish victory. One reason for this was the successful Finnish harassment of Soviet supply lines. More generally, protecting one's own supply lines and attacking those of an enemy is a fundamental military strategy. An example of this is a purely logistical campaign. For the military means of implementing strategic policy was the Berlin airlift. Military logistics has pioneered a number of techniques that have since become widely deployed in the commercial world. Operations research grew out of World War II military logistics efforts. Likewise, military logistics borrows from methods first introduced to the commercial world. The Kargil conflict in 1999 between India and Pakistan, also referred to as Operation Vijay, is one of the most recent examples of high-altitude warfare in mountainous terrain that posed significant logistical problems for the combating sides. The Stallion, which forms the bulk of the Indian Army's logistical vehicles, proved its reliability and serviceability with 95% operational availability during the operation. Loss of strength gradient. Geographic distance is a key factor in military affairs. The shorter the distance, the greater the ease with which force can be brought to bear upon an opponent. This is because it is easier to undertake the supply of logistics to a force on the ground as well as engage in bombardment. The importance of distance is demonstrated by the loss of strength gradient devised by Kenneth Boulding. This shows the advantage of supply that is forward-based. U.S. Armed Forces classes of supply. The United States military logistics support is grouped into 10 classes of supply. Supply chain management in military logistics often deals with a number of variables in predicting cost, deterioration, consumption, and future demand. The U.S. military's categorical supply classification was developed in such a way that categories of supply with similar consumption variables are grouped together for planning purposes. For instance, peacetime consumption of ammunition and fuel will be considerably less than wartime consumption of these items, whereas other classes of supply such as subsistence and clothing have a relatively consistent consumption rate regardless of war or peace. Troops will always require uniform and food. More troops will require equally more uniforms and food. In the table above, each class of supply has a consumer. Some classes of supply have a linear demand relationship. As more troops are added, more supply items are needed. As more equipment is used, more fuel and ammo is consumed. Other classes of supply must consider a third variable besides usage and quantity: time. As equipment ages, more and more repair parts are needed over time, even when usage and quantity stays consistent. By recording and analyzing these trends over time and applying to future scenarios, the U.S. military can accurately supply troops with the items necessary at the precise moment they are needed. History has shown that good logistical planning creates a lean and efficient fighting force. Lack thereof can lead to a clunky, slow, and ill-equipped force with too much or too little supply.